Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. On Tuesday, we released a video discussing the early results in the US election, and the comment section was, interesting. It seemed that a huge number of people seemed to believe that the election was fraudulent, or that Biden was attempting to steal the election. So I reached out to as many of them as I could find to ask them for proof. You may not be surprised to hear that I didn't get many responses, and the ones I did either failed to provide any sources or largely weren't of much use. Luckily though, I wasn't genuinely expecting the comments section to do the research for me, so we dug deeper to find out for ourselves. Before we do dive in though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're going to continue covering the election and US politics more generally as the days go on, so hit subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when we post. Oh, and our stats show that only 16% of our viewers have subscribed, so lend us a hand and join the crew. Now, I want to start this by saying that the comments we'll be debunking in this video are mainly from one side of the political spectrum, and I want to clarify that this isn't a partisan statement from us. TLDR, as always, does its best to stay neutral and tell stories from both sides. However, when it comes to misinformation, and when it fundamentally threatens democracy and rule of law, we cannot stand by. You can read our full statement on this at tldrnews.co.uk/democracy. I think it's important to start by discussing the central tenet of a lot of these claims and comments, the fact that Biden seems to be performing better in mail-in votes than Trump. This, from all the information we have so far, seems to be accurate, and while it does sound less fun than vote dumping and Sharpies, it's an important place for us to start. Put simply, the Democratic campaign put far more effort into encouraging voters to vote by mail. Democrats expanded a lot of energy trying to turn out mail-in voters, while Trump consistently attempted to discredit the mail-in system, exaggerating the issues the system had. We're not saying that mail-in is perfect, just that Trump voters aren't likely to actively use a system that the person they're voting for says is bad. Secondly, as with everything in 2020, the pandemic is a big factor, and whether you call it democratic fearmongering or the president downplaying the crisis, Democrats on the whole are more likely to be concerned about COVID. Pew Research, conducted in June, showed that 64% of Democrats worry that someone they know will require hospitalization with COVID, and 77% worry about spreading it to others. Among Republicans, that number sat at 35 and 45%. So it just makes sense that Republicans will be less worried about going out to vote in person, and therefore less likely to seek out mail-in ballots. So why is this important? Well, a lot of people are talking about suspicious jumps in Biden's count, or the fact that as time goes on, Biden's slowly creeping up in battleground states. The second of these things is incredibly easy to explain, and you won't be surprised to hear the answer's mail-in ballots. Essentially, most states had three things to handle when tabulating election results: in-person votes, early voting, and mail-in voting. Each state handled these things differently, with them counting and announcing results in different orders. And considering that mail-in votes are more likely to be from Biden voters, and in-person votes are more likely to be from Trump supporters, that order matters. Take the state of Ohio. In the state, ahead of election day, mail-in votes are given to bipartisan teams, who scan envelopes and complete checks. Presuming everything checks out, they're officially scanned into the system, and the computers register the votes. All of this happens ahead of time. However, the computers don't tabulate the votes until the polls close, so no staff know the results as they come in, and as they're not connected to the internet, no one else does either. Then when polls officially close, poll workers simply get the computers to tabulate the votes, and bam, the county can declare almost all of their mail-in votes immediately. As you might expect, this helped Biden initially. Having a whole bunch of early votes, which lean Biden, declared first, got him off to a good start. However, as things progressed, other votes have been added to the results, including often Trump-leaning in-person votes. So, as you might expect, Trump ended up clawing back that lead, eventually ending in a Trump call. In fact, a very similar thing is happening in Arizona. As more votes come in, the president is slowly narrowing the lead. But what about if we flipped this? What if in-person votes came in first and mail-in votes come in later? Well, that's what happened in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. This helped Trump get off to an early lead, with in-person voting being tabulated first, before mail-in ballots are slowly added to the count. So when people say that all battleground states are slowly finding votes for Biden and that that's suspicious, it's not quite right. In some states, in fact, it was just the opposite. So it seems more than a little inconsistent when in Trump's press conference he complains about votes still being counted in states where his lead is slipping, but is completely unfazed by the states where he's gaining on Biden. Also, it's often not the fault of those who are conducting the count. In Michigan, one of the states we mentioned earlier, they weren't allowed to begin processing mail-in votes until 7 p.m. on the day of the election, with a 10-hour head start given to some bigger counties. And you won't be surprised to hear that other slower states, including Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, have similar rules, so it's inevitable that mail-in votes come in second and slower. It's also worth noting the irony that in some of these states, it was the Republican state government who refused to change the rules and allow processing of mail-in votes to start sooner, actively making this confusion worse. Actually, let's go back to that claim. It's not just the fact that not all states are slowly trending Biden that's an issue, it's also the concept of finding ballots. It needs to be said that ballots aren't just being found. If they're getting counted, they were legal ballots. Just because they weren't counted immediately doesn't mean they're not legitimate. Just because Biden might be finding more success in ballots counted later, often because they're mail-in, doesn't necessarily mean they're being found anywhere. They were always in the pile, just waiting for election officials to get to them. Speaking of election officials getting to them, there's also a lot of controversy about states supposedly stopping counts overnight, with posts like this one circling online. The problem is that it's simply not true. Michigan officials told PolitiFact in no uncertain terms that counts did not stop overnight. And you can even use the Wayback Time Machine to go back in time, and you can see that on the Pennsylvania and Wisconsin official election results pages, the numbers continue to be updated throughout the night. It is true that a handful of counties in important states did indeed stop counting, but this was due to staffing constraints in these counts, and the fact that poll workers needed to sleep. Considering that ballots were monitored and controlled over this time, it would surely be more worrying if ballot counters continued to keep going without sleep and ended up making mistakes. It's also worth saying that a good percentage of these counties that did stop are Republican run and were encouraged by the state to continue. Anyway, a lot of this concern is likely compounded by a tweet from Matt McCowick, which claimed that Biden suddenly was given 126,000 votes in one go, with no votes going to Trump. The problem is that this wasn't true, and Matt even rescinded his own tweet later. So here's what actually happened. Early on Wednesday morning, an election map was shared suggesting that Biden had suddenly been awarded 140,000 votes, while Trump had got 0. This was of course eye-catching, and even the president tweeted about it. Turns out that it was all just a typo though, on one county's submission, and not even an official submission. An official at Shiawassee County, Michigan, accidentally mistyped Biden's result, adding an extra 0, and this was only on the county's unofficial count, and it was picked up within minutes by state officials. Unsurprising really, considering the county only has 54,000 registered voters as of August. Anyway, this error was spotted by other people, including the guy we mentioned earlier, leading to conspiracy theories that Biden was suddenly picking up thousands of votes. Matt obviously took back his tweet, and Decision Desk HQ, the place he got his map from, tweeted confirming that it was purely just an error. Allegedly suspicious Biden bumps in the count weren't the only thing that people seemed to spot during election night. Others widely claimed that more votes were being cast than there were registered voters in some states. This would obviously be bad, and demonstrate people voting who weren't registered. The problem with these reports is that they aren't true. It's impossible to debunk the myriad of claims, but they all have similar issues, either using incorrect numbers or out-of-date registration information. However, as an example, this widely shared tweet gets it completely wrong, using out-of-date registration counts. I mean, it's not even subtle. Literally just go to the URL at the bottom of the tweet and you immediately find that the numbers don't match. If we use the real numbers, yeah, it looks a little less worrying. Also, in some states, you can register and vote on the same day, So even if the votes did exceed registered voter totals, it wouldn't necessarily mean that anything had gone wrong. One slightly more interesting story is that in Arizona, voters in Trump-leaning counties were given Sharpies to vote with, allegedly so that the ink would go through the page and the votes wouldn't be counted. The first problem is that this doesn't seem to be true, with Maricopa County officials saying that the voters were actually given fine tip markers, which they claimed were the best for the job. But the real issue is that the core claim isn't right, with Katie Hobbs, Arizona's Secretary of State, saying that ballots marked with Sharpie are being counted and the ballots are still valid. This is also backed up by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, a federal agency, who confirmed that even ballots which can't be scanned are then processed by humans, who aren't as easily fooled by Sharpie bleed. And finally, and the one that a lot of you have probably been waiting for, Project Veritas. For those of you who don't know, Project Veritas describe themselves as a non-profit company dedicated to investigative and undercover journalism. And they've released some pretty provocative videos recently, including, most notably, a USPS insider in Michigan who told Veritas that they'd been advised by management to separate ballots they collected on the day after the election, so that they could be hand-stamped with the day before, thus making the ballots valid in the state. If this were true, it would obviously be very worrying and very substantial. The problem at this point is that it's being shared as if it is true, without any real evidence. Note, we're not saying that this isn't true. All we're saying is that James O'Keefe spoke with a man who claimed to work for USPS, who didn't reveal his identity and had his voice scrambled. And I get it. Protection of whistleblowers is common and important. But that's when people are going through the official reporting channels, rather than going to O'Keefe, who, it should be said, doesn't appear to have the best track record. I mean, a well-reputed book on misinformation, written by 3 Harvard professors, described Project Veritas as a right-wing disinformation outfit, while the New York Times has recently described their videos as using unidentified sources and with no verifiable evidence, something that Veritas is currently suing them over. So we don't yet know the accuracy of this video or the others released recently by the organisation, but it's safe to say that due to their track record, we probably want to wait for more evidence and investigations before we trust everything being said at first glance, which, to be fair, is a safe policy to make with any partisan outlet. Ultimately though, wide-reaching voter fraud that has any chance of swinging the election is unlikely in 2020, because it always is. People love talking about voter fraud because it's part scary and part exciting. It's a fascinating, slightly conspiratorial topic that people love to click on. However, despite its alluring image, voter fraud generally just isn't that common or interesting. Research from electoral experts at the Brennan Center for Justice show that electoral fraud just isn't as common as you might think, remarking in a recent report that despite allegations of voter fraud in 2016 and 2018, the extensive research reveals that fraud is very rare, voter impersonation is virtually non-existent, and many instances of alleged fraud are in fact mistakes made by voters or administrators. In fact, in 2016, there were only 4 documented cases of voter fraud, with a paper published in the same year finding that the absolute maximum upper limit of voter fraud was 0.02%, so not exactly enough to swing the result. In fact, incidence rates for voter fraud are so low that Americans have a higher chance of being struck by lightning than having their vote stolen. All of this isn't to say that shady things can't have happened in the 2020 elections. We may indeed find a handful of double votes like we did in 2016, or maybe even something more worrying. The point is that there's no evidence of that at this stage, and that all the big talking points are probably incorrect. We may find something in the future, and if we do, it should be investigated and it will come out in the courts. But baseless conspiracies like this shouldn't be used to block the counting of legitimate votes, because if we decide we just don't want to count the votes we don't like, then is this even a democracy anymore? If you think we've missed something, and you've got a genuine theory with evidence that can meet my simple test, then great, comment below or email it to voterfraud@tldrnews.co.uk, and maybe we'll even make a follow-up video discussing those theories. To make sure you see any follow-up videos and the rest of our content, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then be sure to back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.